over 30 years of neurosurgical practice and reflecting on neurosurgery, the questions that I've had mirror the questions that the Bradley Center is asking. The questions include, what is thought, and are humans unique? What is artificial intelligence, and can machines think? And what will artificial intelligence do to us? How will it change us? Neuroscience offers considerable insight into what human thought is, and that insight is not what one would take from the materialist perspective. There are three seminal research projects in the 20th century that give us a deep insight into what human thought is. The first is of Wilder Penfield. Dr. Penfield was a neurosurgeon at in Canada, and he was a pioneer in the mid-20th century on epilepsy surgery. And he did open craniotomies with patients awake. He'd use local anesthesia so they felt no pain. The brain has no sensation of pain. And he would study their brains by stimulating various regions of the brain to find epileptic foci that he could then treat. So he had experience with thousands of people who were awake while he was stimulating their brains. And he began his career as a devout materialist. He was a scientist. Materialism, he felt, explained all of the mind. And he ended his career as a passionate dualist. And this was based on two observations that he made. The first was that when he would stimulate people's brains, he could cause all manner of experience for the patient. He could have the patient raise their arm, he could have the patient move their leg, he could have them move their face, or even say a word, or see a flash of light, depending on where he stimulated the brain. I've had that experience myself, not only as a surgeon, but as a volunteer in a project that used a magnetic stimulator that just held outside of my skull, and I had my own arm move that same way by stimulating my cortex. And what Penfield found, much to his consternation, was that he could not simulate agency on the part of the patient. That is, when he would stimulate the brain, he would ask the patient, who just did that? Because the patient would move their arm. They couldn't see what he was doing, so they didn't know they were stimulated. They would always say, you stimulated me. You made my arm move. He would have them move their arm on their own, and then he would make it move. They could always tell the difference. He searched for agency using his electrodes, and over 30 years he couldn't find it. So he said the agency is not material. The actual movement is mediated by a circuit, but the agency is something different. The other thing he noted, which is a fascinating observation that remarkably has gone completely unquestioned in medical science, is he asked, why are there no intellectual seizures? We know about seizures. You know, people can fall down, they shake all over, or you can have milder seizures where you just move a limb, or where your face twitches, or whether you have an abnormal smell or have visual phenomena. But you never start doing calculus when you have a seizure. And you never contemplate justice, and you never contemplate political science. And the question is, well, if large portions of the brain are devoted to higher intellectual functioning, why don't seizures occasionally make you take second derivatives instead of just jerk your arm? And they never, ever do. In 30 years of practice, I've never seen a seizure have any intellectual evocation. And Penfield asked, why are there no intellectual seizures? So his answer as to why he could not find agency by stimulating the brain and why he never observed an intellectual seizure was that the intellect and the will in human beings is not in the brain. It's not material. The brain mediates it, but doesn't give rise to it. The second line of research was that of Roger Sperry, who is a Nobel laureate, was a Nobel laureate working at Caltech. And Sperry studied split brain patients. You may have heard of these people. They're patients who've had surgery in which the hemispheres of their brain are surgically disconnected. We actually cut through a fiber bundle between the hemispheres so that their brain now really is two brains, essentially. There are connections deeper down, but they don't connect the hemispheres very effectively. And this is done to stop seizures. There are rare kinds of seizures that start in one hemisphere and spread to the other, that if you can disconnect the hemispheres, the seizures are much milder and much easier to live with. So these operations have been done really since the 1930s, and they work very well. And Sperry took these patients and he studied them in detail because he wanted to ask what happens to someone's mind when you cut their brain in half. And the remarkable result of Sperry's work isn't what he won the Nobel Prize for. He won the Nobel Prize because he found a whole bunch of subtle perceptual changes, very, very interesting things. The remarkable thing was that he had to do Nobel Prize level research to find any difference at all. That is, I've known many of these patients. I've done the surgery. These are normal people. You meet them, I talk to them, their brains are cut in half, but they're still one person. They're completely unitary. They don't have two minds. They don't have two intellects or two wills. None of that. The only differences they have are subtle perceptual things. For example, the left hemisphere is usually the speech hemisphere. And if you have your brain cut in half, only something presented to your right visual field, which is the visual field that your left hemisphere sees, can you speak about. You can't speak about things in your left visual field that your right hemisphere sees, because your right hemisphere doesn't have speech. Now, what people do is they'll look and they'll cheat, even unconsciously. So there are perceptual differences, and they're differences that won Sperry a Nobel Prize for figuring out, but they're very subtle. Your intellect, your will, your sense of self is still unitary, even though your brain is split in half. So what Sperry showed, in the same way that Penfield showed, that agency and intellect in human beings is immaterial, Sperry showed that the mind is metaphysically simple. It can't be cut. You can't split the mind. But you can split the brain, but not the mind. The third line of research was that of Benjamin Libet. Libet is a researcher who I think should have won the Nobel Prize. He's a brilliant man, worked at the University of San Francisco in the mid-20th century. And Libet studied the timing relationship between brain waves and thoughts. When you think, you get brain waves usually, and he wanted to know what was the timing between them. It was very difficult research because it's hard to time, but he did. And he particularly was interested in the question of free will. So Libet asked volunteers to make a decision to do something and then do it, like push a button. And he put electrodes on their scalp, and he found consistently that when you make a decision, a simple decision to do something, a yes or no decision, that about half a second before you make the decision, a half a second before you're aware of making a decision, you have a brain wave. And the brain fires, and then a half a second later you say, I'm going to push the button. It made it seem as though free will wasn't real. It made it seem as though unconscious brain activity drove you. And you thought you chose to push the button, but your brain really told you to do it, and you mistakenly think you have free will. But Libet, being a first-rate scientist, didn't stop at that. What he did was rather clever. He asked his volunteers then, make your decision to push the button and then immediately veto that decision. Decide, I'm going to push this button. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. And he recorded their brainwaves when they did that. And he found that when you veto the decision, there's no brainwave at all. So you have brainwave, awareness of decision, veto decision is silent in the brain, but you would veto the decision. So Libet said, we might not have free will, but we have free won't. And he was very well versed in theology. Actually, he was rather deeply philosophical and theological man. And he said, "This is a beautiful scientific example of temptation and sin." He said, "We are constantly presented with unconscious brain motives to do things, but we have the immaterial free choice as to whether or not to do it. We can veto it or we can accept it." So he said the original sin is a real thing, and he measured it in his laboratory. So Libet showed that free will is real. Sperry showed that the mind is metaphysically simple. And Penfield showed that at least the intellect and will are immaterial.